So Dean and I are really just going to give you kind of a broad overview of UVic's new digital asset management system. And that system is built on Samvera, which used to be called Hydra, so you can kind of use those interoperably, although not legally. And Samvera is really a kind of tool set that sits on top of Fedora and Fedora 4. And I would say that to a large extent, our end game is really to get into Fedora 4 more than it is to necessarily embrace the tools that sit on top of Fedora 4, but you have to get into Fedora 4 somehow. So Samvera is the pathway that we've chosen for that. And Samvera, this is a nice simple diagram, but Samvera is actually quite a complex stack of open source components, which means that it's really configurable and flexible. But if you want the simple way of installing it, then you probably should be looking at Hyku, which used to be called Hydra in a box. And it is the most turnkey solution. I would not say it's exactly turnkey, to be quite honest, but it's the closest thing that you can get to kind of a pre-generated application that you could easily install in a sandbox to play with, for example. And at UVic, our instance of Hyku is branded as Vault, and it is not in production. It's very much in development, but it is actually accessible on the internet, so you can go and have a look. We don't promise you that you won't find errors when you get there, but we have begun to migrate our collections over at this point. And we began to consider about 2 years ago a replacement for our CONTENTdm system. CONTENTdm has been a real workhorse for us at UVic. It's served us pretty well, but it's starting to not align that well with some of our strategic objectives. And one of those, particularly, is to try to roll out our infrastructure to faculty to use in their research projects. So we have recently released the grants menu. You can see that there's a tiny CC for that here if you want to have a look at it. And what the grants menu tries to do is to articulate the in-kind value that library software can bring to faculty grant applications. So if you bring the library in as a partner, here are some exact values that you can put into your grant applications as in-kind. So one of the things that we want to do here is offer our DAMS to faculty who are either working with a lot of digital objects or creating a lot of digital objects in their research. So there are some things that we really require in a new system to be able to do this. And one simple but critical thing is that we have to have a web client. Our current CONTENTdm instance has an installed desktop client, and just that in itself is actually a real obstacle to broad collaboration. Something else that we need is a system that supports multi-tenancy, because we know those faculty members, they're not just going to want a collection in our digital asset management system that you search with all the rest of the library stuff. They're going to want their own URL, their own look and feel, their own indexes, and their own kinds of user permissions. So we need a system that can support that as well. We really need better tools for working with images. And the IIIF is one of the things that is supported by Samvera, so we're working really hard to get all of our images into IIIF. And that'll help us with things like viewing, but also comparing and sharing, and especially annotating images, which we don't have a great solution for image annotation yet, and you'd think that would be a solved problem, but it kind of isn't. We have ideas about how to do it, but we're not necessarily doing it that well. We are using the Spotlight exhibit platform, and we have a couple of exhibits that we're pretty proud of, so we invite you to go and have a look at that as well. But we wanted a DAMS that could integrate kind of tightly with this solution, so objects in our DAMS could easily be pulled into exhibits, and then you could do narrative and context within that exhibit platform. These two things, I should say, are not well integrated right now, but they both use Ruby and they have similar architecture, so there's hope that we'll be able to make that happen. We really generally wanted more control over the development of our system, and we wanted to be able to roll out features when we need them rather than wait for long development cycles. But particularly, if we're going to work with faculty and they're bringing in research funding, we would love to be able to use some of their research funding to develop new features in our systems that can then be shared with all the other faculty who need those same features, instead of having that money spent on building these little siloed pieces of software all over campus that aren't very sustainable and which don't have any broader benefit beyond the project that they're actually working on. Digital preservation is a huge issue for us now. I'm sure that's true in all of your libraries as well. And we really needed a data store that could be a strong foundation for all of our emerging digital preservation activities. So Fedora 4 is really optimized for library digital preservation activities. It incorporates premise, so metadata that in a standard way describes preservation events, for example. And Fedora 4 has built-in versioning software, so you can roll back to a previous version of an object. That's something we haven't had before. It automatically generates checksums for objects and allows you to use an HTTP API to run audits on those objects over time to make sure that you have that your files haven't degenerated in some way that isn't otherwise obvious. The system creates globally unique identifiers for every object in the system, and that identifier stays with that object through its life cycle. So if you move something around between collections or you do a bunch of stuff to it, it still has the same identifier. Makes it easier for audits. And the whole system is built on linked data principles, so these URIs are also globally web addressable, so all of our objects and metadata can easily be just contacted over the web, and we like that as well. Fedora 4 is based on the linked data platform specification to organize RDF resources and binary files, and the whole Fedora 4 data model now is using linked data attributes. The LDP exposes standard, well-documented APIs for doing all of these kind of create, read, update, and delete operations within the system, and it's just over HTTP, so the web is kind of the platform for a lot of this stuff. It also introduces the Portland Common data model, which is important for describing complex objects, so the pages in a book, or a bunch of postcards in a box, or a collection of objects. And the linked open data architecture generally results, we hope it will result, I should say, in a data model that's really scalable and that's really interoperable and that's really web native, that really takes advantage of web protocols and of web architecture. And we think that those are things that are going to optimize our objects for reuse, because we're not really building for this system. The systems aren't permanent, and we know that, but our metadata and our objects hopefully are more permanent. So getting the data model right, getting the data right, that's what we're trying to achieve in this system. And then finally, you can plug an external Triplestore into Fedora 4, which is really cool because that allows us to look at all of our metadata in kind of graph forms and to explore it in ways that we haven't been able to before. But because it's external, it also allows us to bring in other data sources so we can see our data in other contexts. We can try to understand how it links or should link to other data sets. So that's something that we've never been able to do before either. So that's really my take on Samvera and why we are doing this and what our hopes are for it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dean to talk about the advantages from the cataloging perspective.
Hi, I'm Dean, and I'm the head of metadata at UVic, and so yeah, I'm going to talk about this move and kind of what it means for us from a metadata point of view. Well, Lisa's actually, I've got why change systems. The Dean version is really the same as Lisa's. Fedora 4, definitely. The fact that it's open source and it's linked data is good. And also, we've been using CONTENTdm for about the last 8 years, and there's also a little bit of knowledge there that there's got to be a better way, right? So. Yeah, so not only entering metadata, but managing people who use it. So I'm going to argue that this has given us a few things. First is a chance to rethink our metadata. Second is a chance to get our feet wet with linked data practically a little bit after talking about it for so long. And third is agency. So rethink our metadata. Before we actually made the decision to move systems, we kind of analyzed what was in CONTENTdm. We had 52 different collections, because CONTENTdm kind of forces you to create collections for each different digital collection with its own properties or fields. So 162 unique local fields, and 89 of those fields were used only once, right, across this entire system. So clearly some consistency problems. So alternative title is in there in 14 collections in that particular way, and rights was in there a bunch of different ways as well. So clearly problems with consistency. So first thing to do was to come up with an application profile. We kind of came up with these properties at the various levels and borrowed heavily from places like DPLA and Europeana, and we created a few of our own. But we had so much evidence, right? So we had all these metadata fields that were in CONTENTdm, so that was a good starting point. We're not starting from scratch. We kind of know the metadata that we already have and how we've used it in the past. So this kind of we can kind of make informed decisions about how this metadata application profile should look. And consistent syntax. So let's talk about, beyond the properties, let's talk about the values in those metadata fields, right? So consistent syntax, so things like EDTF, whenever possible. Controlled vocabularies, not the word of the day, I understand. But yes, we're using FAST and AAT thesaurus and others for consistency, really, and for their association with identifiers and URIs, since we're kind of going more into linked data. You need those identifiers and URIs to make that happen. So clearly, we're kind of making a decision here. We recognize, or I recognize that we're making this decision, that we're going for interoperability. It's more important that all this metadata can talk to each other over a lot of these collections, and more than that, that this metadata can talk to other systems and other metadata out there in the world, and we're giving up a little bit of flexibility, specificity, and some of that is intentional and some of it isn't. All right, linked data. So yeah, all about identifiers and URIs, and I want to give a practical apology for linked data. It's used in a bunch of different ways by a bunch of different people, and some people use it in a particular way, and then other people get really mad. I don't know. So anyway, this is why I like linked data after managing people who enter metadata for a long time. I don't like typed out text strings. In fact, I quite hate them whenever possible, so let's kind of use identifiers as opposed to those things. And global identifiers or URIs full of context and other linkages is probably better than a local identifier. So again, trying to get rid of this whenever possible. And I understand this might be my my personal and professional legacy, possibly. That's okay. I'm comfortable with that. And the third thing I'm going to argue this gives us is a little bit of agency, but for what, right? So, and often I don't get a say, right, in how systems are developed, personally. So this is great. So agency to enact certain principles, and it's kind of a vague statement, but what principles are we talking about? We need both people and machines to migrate data and to create good data. Machines can't do everything, but we should try to get the machine to do as much as possible. And humans of varying technical skill need to help create good data. So we're not going to create maybe an army of experts in Kathmandu and OpenRefine. We need people have a lot of knowledge about these objects. So how do we get them to actually create that? And so, yeah, I mean, machine data creation, maybe you have an OCR of a particular document, and the machine says, oh, I'm pretty sure the document creator is Bill Bennett, but then human judgment required. If we are going back to controlled vocabularies, which Bill Bennett are we talking about? So we need some kind of human judgment, and you ask the machine, and it kind of looks at you and goes, I don't know. So, and then at the end of that, of course, is machine consumption and human consumption. So how do we actually enact these principles? Well, Braden Justice, who is the software developer who is working on Samvera for us, created this tool. Since we have 50-some different collections that properties have to be matched from CONTENTdm into the application profile properties from Samvera, we need to actually think of a way to make that a little bit more efficient. I mean, the machine doesn't know what collaborator maps to in Samvera, for example, and a human needs to do that. But again, it kind of automatically pulls that metadata out and those properties out, so a human can actually go in and make these decisions, and then it gets exported with the new properties. And that takes care of some things, but not everything, right? So we have this new content of these metadata fields as well. There's two aspects, right? There's the fields or the properties, and then there's the values. So what about these values, and how are we going to bring these over? And so again, we kind of created this tool, and all this is openly available, called Vaultify, to actually look at the values in particular properties, and to try to automatically assign from controlled vocabularies as much as possible. And it does this pretty well, probably a little bit of improvement there, but it will kind of try to automatically assign a lot of these values when possible, and syntax for things like dates when possible too. And, of course, we're imagining this marriage between machines and humans, or IM. It's fine. So a human being is actually able to go into this at the end and just kind of eyeball it and say, yeah, that's right, or that's wrong, and I want to actually bring in a different controlled vocabulary term and its associated identifier. So that's fine for the migration, but how do we, again, kind of marry these two ideas that, human beings and machines both need to be involved in this metadata creation? Well, things like autocomplete and controlled vocabularies, again, retrieve URIs, help to standardize the syntax whenever possible, and help to standardize other content whenever possible. So since we anticipate not just having kind of experts or people in cataloging or a metadata division enter metadata into this system, we need to kind of provide a lot of in-context help so that we kind of help people create better data. And since it is an open system, we actually are able to kind of be a part of a larger grant initiative out of the University of Houston to kind of think about these migration tools from CONTENTdm to Hyku. And that's my bit done, so thank you. Questions? I'm sorry, yeah.
Lisa, this relates back to something you mentioned in your half of the presentation. You talked about, instead of having all these independent projects with different faculties working, trying to get them more involved in a centralized project. What do you do to talk to them? Is there any, just maybe to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I would definitely suggest that you have a look at the grants menu, because I think the way to talk to faculty is to talk to them about the things that they care about, and research funding is one of the things they really care about. And I don't think that this system can be everybody's research platform. There are people doing all sorts of different things, and they wouldn't necessarily be well suited. But we do know that there are a lot of faculty who basically just build like PHP interfaces to SQL databases to run all their data, and they make up their own data models. And those are people who could be working in our systems. So rolling out the grants menu and talking to the research officers in the different faculties, letting them know that we have this, and if somebody's doing a project that uses a lot of these kind of digital objects, that they might consider using the library. And they're usually looking for in-kind contributions. And they're happy to have the help a lot of the time, because the digital humanists that I work with are not in it to write the software. They're in it for a specific research question. So if we can kind of alleviate the burden of having to write the software, then that's actually really helpful to them, because they can use their money to do things way more specifically directed to their research question. So I think that really starting with grants, that's where we think we can kind of insert ourselves into that process. And that's also the time we want to start talking to them about digital preservation anyway. So it's a convenient time to kind of offer something. But I think having those like dollar values right in the grants menu is something that helps to get their attention, quite honestly.
Have you got anybody on board so far? Or this
Yeah, we have used that menu to write, I would say at least 10 different grant applications at this point. Part of me is concerned that what if we get all those grants? Because I actually don't think we can do that many at once. But that isn't the way it works, of course. More of them will be rejected than will be accepted. So,
good problems to have.
then we can, if we can show some success, then we can scale up more easily, right?
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, I'm sorry, am I audible? I'm realizing I have never properly understood the scope of what you're doing until now. And that,
I'm afraid now. If Peter thinks the scope is big, that's worrying.
well, it's big, but it's also different. I mean, the fact that that you start at the grant proposal moment and sort of follow through the production of stuff that you're going to end up publishing, acting as publisher of, rather than as, you know, our scope at the moment for the work we're engaged in is institutional repository. Give us your, we know you have to give us your thesis because you can't graduate without it. Give us all your other stuff and we'll host it and publish it and so on. But tying in that tightly to the research funding flow is that's a whole different beast. And so I'm just wondering, how much of an overlap do you see between what you're doing in that line with, I guess what we can now call a traditional institutional repository that accepts donated, what should I call it, donated content for hosting for sort of off the road academic credit, but not in the mainstream of getting your research out there. Can you do both? Are you doing both?
I think that we can do this for some projects, and it depends on the kind of project and what types of objects they're producing and how big those objects are, and a lot of other things like that. So what I'm trying to do is find out where we are a good fit for a project. So an example is that the head of anthropology wants to, is going to Africa to collect a lot of objects from a community, and she needs a place to put them, and I'm like, that's not a stretch for for our digital asset management system, that's really what it's kind of built for. And so there are a lot of needs that can easily be met with most of the features that we currently have. I think that one thing that changes in this workflow is that if faculty are going to use our infrastructure, then we have a commitment to teaching them how to do that, teaching them to some extent about the standards that we will need them to use, probably working with their graduate students more often than faculty. But there's a whole new teaching component to that and liaison component to that that we have not previously done, and that I think we are a little bit anxious about. But once again, it depends if we get a deluge of requests, then we'll be overwhelmed very quickly. But if we can start with a few and kind of learn our lessons and build up, and we have support from university administration are quite interested to see where this will go. So I think we can make arguments for more of the kinds of supports that we need as we go. Does that answer you?
Yeah. No, I'll,
Okay.
come back and tell us more about that next year.
Is there time for one more real quick? I have a policy question real quick. It has to do with, you're talking about, how much capacity you have to take in these researchers' objects. But the one thing that maybe I'm not clear, and if you said this, again, apologies, because you can't always pick up every detail. Would you consider then these objects that might be coming out of research projects as part of the library's digital collections? Is there sort of a provenance issue there? Because one of the discussions we have around our digital archive is if we take these things in, are we assuming that then they become sort of part of the universe we consider our preservation obligation? So sort of the intellectual ownership, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I think we are actually imagining that these will become part of our collection, at least for the purposes of digital preservation. And that's one of the reasons we'd like to onboard them to the DAMS rather than trying to take projects that exist in other places, because we are getting a lot more requests from researchers about digital preservation. And usually it's halfway through a research project. We've had no input into the metadata. We've had no input into the technology. So it's kind of a problem that we already have. And we see this as a bit of a solution to that problem. At least if they're working in our systems and we can kind of work with them on metadata models from the beginning, then they will have stuff that's more easily preservable. And whether we're doing 100,000 or 200,000 or 1 million objects, if they're all the same, it's a lot easier than trying to do even 10 objects that are all completely different. So yeah, I think we'll take responsibility for the digital preservation of things that come into this system, absolutely. Whether they'll ever be indexed as part of the maybe we can make those decisions over time. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, guys.